George Hampel, born 4th October 1933, died 8th October 2024, aged 91. Called to the Australian Bar in 1958 and a Justice of the Supreme Court of Victoria from 1983 to 2000. And thus, Wikipedia summarizes his life and career. Even their expanded description only takes about 5 or 6 paragraphs, and much of that is not relevant to the man himself. Is that all there is to George Hampel? No, it is not. Is there more to George Hampel than that he created a training method for advocacy? Indeed there is. There is masses more. So much, in fact, that although I will maintain a chronology, I will interpose it with life themes, those elements of a truly fascinating man which kept returning to him over a long and full life. Whilst we are absolutely delighted to have Felicity here, staring at me from the front row, it is daunting to try and do justice to George when I'm in the presence of someone who knew him so well for over 40 years. But I have her to thank for supplying me with many photographs of his life and for providing me with a copy of the very moving address she gave at his funeral. I hope others will feel able to share reminiscences later in the evening and fill in whatever I have failed to mention. If you do, please wait until you get a microphone in your hand. Felicity will interpose in any of that conversation at that stage, rather than giving a sort of reply, as might be suggested from the material you have received. He only provided the odd snippet about his experiences during the war, and no one was able to persuade him, not even Felicity, to write about it. Fortunately, he opened up in a recording made to the Melbourne Holocaust Society, who interviewed George on the 12th of March 2024, which allows me to tell his story, and better still, to bring George literally to life as he tells his story for me. George sent me a message to me saying that he would love to talk to me about the interview after I had seen it. It did not happen. What a wonderful conversation I missed. So George was born in Warsaw. His Polish name was Jesse. I wish he kept it. His father was a solicitor and practiced from home, which was a pretty grand and spacious apartment. His parents employed a cook. George had a nanny. George would try on his father's court robes when he was allowed into his father's study. And it cannot be a coincidence that eventually, and I mean eventually, George turned to the law. He spoke about his parents with great affection, but I believe that it was his mother who had the greatest influence on him. He spoke of his great memories of his mother, how they would sing and dance together. She was a mathematician and practiced as an actuary. Both his parents travelled widely, quite extraordinarily so when you think of the time. And she taught at the Sorbonne. She spoke 4 languages fluently. Whatever he inherited from his father, the influence of his mother as a teacher and a linguist could be seen in George in spades. His parents had a wide circle of friends, and importantly, as you'll learn in a moment, his father, a keen cyclist, used to go on rides with a high-ranking Polish general. I hope Master Alistair Hodge will tell us something later about the trip he made to Warsaw with George to train Polish advocates. George, ever proud of his linguistic skills, made reference to this in his interview. And let's see if I can make it work.
Have you returned to Poland? Well, you mentioned you have.
Yes, I mentioned once I returned purely as a tourist. But the second time Felicity and I went to Poland was at the invitation of the Polish Bar to teach them advocacy.
Okay.
Which was a great experience. It was a funny experience because the organisers of the invited us knew that I was born in Polish, in Warsaw, and spoke English. But the people who were teaching, about 40 fairly senior advocates, had no idea. They just thought I was an Australian visitor. Anyway, after a day or so with them, I said to them, you know, Polish is a very simple language. I've only been here 4 days, and I've learnt it. And I started speaking Polish to them. They nearly collapsed. Then I had to disclose. It was funny.
As for his mother's influence on his dancing, that too was often apparent. I remember an occasion when he came with Felicity over here to help us with a workshop on advanced cross-examination. At the end of the day, a number of the trainers went out to supper, and from supper to a cocktail bar on a roof overlooking Waterloo Bridge. You may know it. Amongst others enjoying a night under the stars was a sizable group of women who were well under a third of George's age, and whose notion of economy did not extend beyond reducing the length of their skirts to save on material. There was music playing, and George started dancing. It was wonderful to watch. I can't produce photographic proof, but will this do? Gives you some idea of the flamboyance of the man and the woman. Well, now, George was born in the year that Hitler came to power in Germany. His parents were non-practicing Jews. Indeed, George described them as humanists. They realized, though, the threat that Hitler posed to Jews in Germany and in Poland, and the influence, and that influenced them not to have a second child. George was aged 6 in 1939, and I'll leave him again to tell the story.
So let's then come to the decision of having to leave Warsaw. How did that eventuate?
That was quite dramatic. By then, Warsaw was being heavily bombed. And
you recall that?
Sorry? Oh, I recall that. Well, I used to run out on the balcony to have a look with all the things that were happening. Really? And my parents got very cross with me and would pull me back. And we had to have the blinds down and lights off and so on. And one day during this period, which was my father's friend, the general, came to our place and said to my parents, according to what I had been told, that there's no place for a Jewish friend of mine in the family to stay in Warsaw. I'm taking you out.
Wow.
Now, he still had a car and a chauffeur because he was, very high up in the... Although the Polish army by then, of course, was decimated.
George went on to explain that his paternal grandfather was visiting them at the time, a 6-day visit, when the war broke out, and he became stranded in Warsaw. Let him take it up again.
And when my father's friend said, they're taking us away, he said, you've got 1 hour to pack what you want into a rucksack. You were only allowed 1 rucksack each. And there was no room for my father in the car because there was the other people, my grandfather and myself and my mother. And my father said, I will ride my back and follow you.
On the bike?
Yes.
Following the car?
That's right.
Incredible.
So that's what he did. And so we left Warsaw in those circumstances.
The Germans entered Warsaw 2 days after they had left. He described how lucky they were. George had 2 cousins to whom he was very close, and with whom, as an only child, he played regularly. They remained in Warsaw, and what he told the interviewer about them is very difficult to listen to. But it explains so much about George's humanity and love for life. I hope you can cope with this. I can't.
Now, can I just go back for a moment and tell you the story that even today makes me very sad, and it causes me a lot of nightmares and terrible feelings. The two cousins, who I so dearly loved me, were shot in front of their parents because their parents were being taken to a labour camp and the kids were too young to go to a labour camp, so bang, bang, in front of their parents.
Where did this occur, George?
Sorry?
Where did this occur?
I'm not sure exactly where, but it would have been in Warsaw because
He spoke of their journey east to get away from the German advance and how Messerschmitts dive-bombed the column of refugees. Each time they would shelter off the road, and he described as both dramatic and traumatic the experience of returning to the road to find it littered with dead bodies. He was 6. After 4 or 5 days, they reached a town called Pinsk on the Russian border.
But we lost my father.
What?
He lost us and we lost him in these thousands of fleeing people.
So he wasn't behind you all the way?
No, somehow I don't know whether he lost us or we lost him or...
You must have been fearful during that time.
Yes, and we lost him. We didn't know where he was. And when we arrived in Pinsk, there was my mother, myself, and our grandfather, but no father. And so, you know, we were lucky to be alive. I mean, my life has been the luckiest life I can possibly imagine right from the start. Where I lived, what happened, and how we survived that journey and from then on. So as a matter of great fortune, we arrived safely in Pinsk. And whilst we were Pinsk was being bombed. The Germans were already moved far enough into Poland. And and the important day in our lives was when we were in an air raid shelter. And my mother looked out over the footpath, you could see from the shelter, and she saw a figure on a bike, and she said, "That's him."
What?
That was a journey, I think, of about 1,500 miles, and they met up. It all gets more cheerful from here on. From Pinsk, they travelled by train with other refugees to Russia. They were dropped off in a logging town on the Volga River. They had no money, nothing appropriate to wear for the Russian winter. A local baker took pity on them and fed and clothed them. His grandfather looked after him and cooked and cleaned, and after a while his father worked and got work as a logger, a solicitor logger, I suppose, and his mother taught maths in return for potatoes and onions. As the Germans advanced towards Russia, they moved further east to the Urals. He went to school without knowing a word of Russian. They remained in Russia until 1945 and the end of the war. He expressed the utmost admiration for the generous Russian people, although he expressly excluded Putin in his interview. And over the years, he said he came to love their literature and music, so much so that he tried at one point to educate me in lesser-known Russian works and their wartime music, with, I have to admit, very little success. At the end of the war, George, now aged 12, and his family got out of Russia and back to Poland just before they closed the borders. To George, another example of miraculous good luck. There they found surviving members of his family, including his grandmother, who was reunited with her husband, who she had expected to be away for those 6 days and not the 6 years that they were parted. They learned for the first time about the horrors of concentration camps and indeed the shooting of his cousins. Now, pausing there for a moment, I wonder whether the early travel by car and then by train over thousands and thousands of miles gave George his lifelong love of travel and cars. He adored fast cars, especially Italian cars, and he continued to drive them until he was 89.5 years of age, when he found himself veering across the overtaking lanes into oncoming traffic. He crashed into the barriers on the opposite side of the road, and he then traded his Fiat for a pacemaker and decided to give up driving. When we visited George and Felicity in Belbray, just off the Great Ocean Road, one of the most spectacular coastal drives in the world, we were introduced to his latest sports car. The keen-eyed may see that he had me in the driving seat, which to those who know my driving better, Master Corner, than he did, would realise was a gross error of judgment on his part. His go-to places were Paris and the ski slopes of France and Italy, but he travelled much further afield. One trip caused his insurers some concern. An agent phoned to confirm that he was intending to fly to Buenos Aires, where he was going to take tango lessons, followed by a cruise to Antarctica, then a flight to Paris for a short break before skiing in Courchevel. Well, George confirmed the details, which led to a follow-up question. Can you confirm that your year of birth is 1933? Well, now back to 1945. They decided, after some months in Warsaw, which was now occupied by Russia, not to stay in Poland because they thought they had no future in a communist regime. Australia won out over the competition of America and Canada. They went first to Paris, and that was the start of his lifelong affection for the city, which he and Felicity revisited on about 40 occasions. He adored the area around the Ile de la Cité, and if they could find a flat either on it or overlooking it, that's where they would stay. They had their favourite cafes, restaurants, and galleries. When Shara and I last joined them in Paris, George, at the age of 88, was suffering from a broken vertebrae sustained before he left Australia. Whilst many half of his age would have stayed at home, George was not to be put off travelling. He rather enjoyed the benefits of a personal wheelchair escort to and from the plane and boarding priority, which exceeded anything he'd known as a Qantas frequent flyer platinum member. He and Felicity had found an apartment on the opposite corner to the La Tour d'Argent. Fortunately, for our combined health and pockets, it was still being renovated, but I do not think it was a complete coincidence that he chose somewhere so close to a famous restaurant. George enjoyed his food and he enjoyed cooking. At Belbray, the kitchen was designed to overlook the sitting area, or was it really the other way round, so that his guests could watch him cooking? Who knows? Like everything that George did, it was about precision. Let me explain. He liked to have very, very lightly cooked scrambled eggs for breakfast. My wife, Shara, is a wondrous cook, but George decided that her attempts at lightly scrambling were being thwarted not by a lack of skill on her part, but because of the pan that she was using. George solved the problem. Out he went, bought her a shallow Le Creuset frying pan, problem solved. I suppose the deprivations of his time in Russia were bound to leave him with a love of good food. The disappointment he felt in poor cooking is illustrated by his description of his first Sunday meal in Australia.
Anyway, we finished up in Sydney.
Right.
And my memory is that it was a hot day, a summer in Sydney, and we went to lunch at the Coogee Bay Hotel.
Okay.
On a hot Sunday. That was my memory.
Okay.
I may be wrong, could have been another
So
day.
who was there to greet you?
My Uncle Leon drove his car all the way from Melbourne to pick us up. But he took us to lunch at this place, and I'll never forget this lunch. And my parents looked at me and I looked at them, and it was shocking. It was a hot lunch on a hot 40-day delivery. A T-bone steak that was beaten to death. Some tinned potatoes that were stained by the beetroot juice from the tinned beetroot. We couldn't believe it. We'd been in Paris for a year, and although Paris was after the war, still Paris food is different.
He does go on to describe the pudding, but there's not time for everything. When not at school, he visited the Parisian art galleries, and so steeped in art did he become that at matriculation in Melbourne he won an art prize, to which I will return. But back to 1946, the family obtained berths on a ship taking consular officials, French consular officials, to their Pacific colonies and protectorates, before ending the journey in Sydney. How much George enjoyed the 2 or 3 week stays in each of the ports on his way, and very happy memories he had, in particular of Tahiti and Martinique. Were there many boys aged 13 who'd seen so much of the world? On arrival in Australia, they moved to Melbourne. George resumed his schooling, this time in a third language, English, which he found very hard to learn. His overqualified parents opened a shop where they made and sold pyjamas and underwear. Rather than spend their money on a much-needed bed and other furniture, they preferred to populate their house with books and subscribe to the concert series. George was ever grateful to them for providing this part of his education. His education continued at Melbourne High School, and that came about because he wanted to move to a school which would allow him to excel at sports. Having already joined a swimming relay team, the rest of whom were Olympic swimmers. So, without telling his parents, he rode over on his bike to the high school and demanded to see the headmaster, who gave him an interview, and having told George that he was a cheeky young brat, accepted him into the school. At matriculation, he was proud to get honours in English Lit and Lang. His enjoyment of sport never changed. How about this as an example? And perhaps a little bit of gentle water skiing. He loved tennis, both playing and watching. His superhero on the tennis court was Roger Federer, who he admired for his skills, grace, and style. He would speak his name in reverential tones. George continued to receive tennis coaching into his 80s, believing that there is no one who cannot improve with the benefit of coaching. See the Hampel method. He could see no reason why he could not become as good as Federer, he told me. Tennis also allowed him to display his determination. On a visit here, when I think he was about 76 or 77, I noticed that he was manipulating his shoulders as if in pain, and I asked him what's wrong. He explained that he'd been playing a 3-setter against a friend and had gone up to hit a high ball and had fallen head over heels backwards and ended up in the wire mesh of the fence at the back. I asked him whether he'd gone to hospital. His answer, no. I got up, I finished the match, and I won. Whilst he played ice hockey for a state team, above all, it was skiing that he adored. He was a ski instructor for many years, and this is where he got the notion that advocacy could be taught using the same techniques as training adults to ski. He was, by all reports, an elegant and natural skier, whether on the runs, or as he often preferred, powder skiing. That is until his doctor finally forbid him to do any more powder when he'd reached 87. Oh, have I gone too far? Yes, I have. You may note from the article that this was newsworthy because at the age of 50, Mr. Justice Hampel was teaching at the French ski school. So back to his teenage years. On leaving school, he got a scholarship to the National Gallery and was offered a job in a screen art studio. George picked up his brush again in his 80s and painted in a contemporary style. A few examples. About 3 weeks before he was due to start at the screen printers, he had a change of mind. And again, picked up his bike and, without telling his parents, rode to Melbourne University, where he was accepted on the law course. After his degree, he qualified as a barrister. At the age of 30, he married Suzanne. It is a testament to him, and probably more to Felicity, that they both remained in touch with his first wife, with whom they would meet up regularly. He excelled at the bar and he took silk. George was briefed to represent John Stonehouse in his extradition proceedings. Stonehouse, a Labour MP, managed to bat off what turned out to be true allegations that he spied for Czechoslovakia, only then to turn to fraud. And on the 20th of November 1974, he tried to fake his own death by leaving a pile of clothes on a beach in Miami, but sadly for him was arrested a month later in Australia. Stonehouse then briefed George to come to England to represent him in a High Court application for bail. It was at this stage that George made one of the few mistakes he ever made. He had to join an inner court. Middle Temple. I don't know how he managed it, but Stonehouse was bailed. He represented himself at trial, came second and was sentenced to 7 years. There is not time to talk about his lifelong interest in philosophy, not just Aristotle, but Lin Yutang, Yuval Noah Harari, and increasingly A.C. Grayling were by his bed and his chair. And now to Felicity. She came as what we would call a pupil into his chambers when he was a silk. George's marriage had already failed, and it is no surprise that she caught first his eye and then his heart. I've mentioned Belbray, where we visited them. That was the second house that George and Felicity had helped design and then project manage. The first being in the Melbourne suburbs, and they completed a third house in Anglesey overlooking the ocean, and into which they moved about a year before he died. It is a testament to their close and loving relationship that they survived 3 house-building ordeals. It was a relationship which thrived on their shared lives as advocates and then as judges, but also on their shared enthusiasm for advocacy training. So it's taken me an awful lot of words, has it not, to get to the point when I can speak about George as the trainer. But again, why should I do it when he can?
And why I mention it is because I learnt in teaching skiing the idea of teaching skills to adults. Because teaching skiing involves the sort of things that I thought could be done for advocates. And so I started the idea of teaching advocacy to barristers. And in 1972, I started teaching advocacy at the Leo Cusson Institute, which is an education institute for lawyers. And I got more and more and more involved. I won't tell you the whole progression of the history, but in the end, I became the person who introduced the concept of teaching of advocacy, which is now known all over the world. In England, it's known as the Hampel method.
Really? Yeah. Wonderful.
And
what
I
a
wrote
wonderful
the book on it. which is used now as compulsory reading for barristers in their training. And I still teach advocacy. And when I met Felicity, and she went to the bar, she started teaching with me as a very young barrister.
Right.
And now she's one of the best teachers I know. So we have taught advocacy all over the world.
Wonderful.
In just about every country and every place.
So although George started teaching advocacy in 1972, we here were Johnny-come-latelys, because it didn't come here until 1994. The Master Treasurer was telling me just before this talk that he was there at that first occasion when George and Felicity came over. The two chief proponents were firstly Michael Hill and then Michael Sherrard came in and joined the fray. Sadly, the two Michaels, as they came to be known colloquially, vied with each other in their own inns to see who could enforce the Hampel method more rigidly. I taught with Michael Hill in 1998. It was terrifying. It was in 2002, maybe 2003, when George would have been 70, that Master Joanna Corner and I taught with George and Felicity on a training course run by Joe for the prosecutors in the War Crimes Tribunal for Rwanda. The first thing we realized when we watched George teach was that he used his own method in a much more relaxed and fluid way, using it as a training tool rather than a straitjacket. We told him of the battle of the two Michaels and persuaded George and Felicity to come to London, or perhaps both, to come to London to deliver an evening lecture, which was catchily titled, I thought, Hampel on Hampel. Can't think who was responsible for that. I'm not sure that George managed to persuade either Michael to take it down a notch, but at least by the end of the evening, many had been persuaded that it could be used in a more relaxed way. And just as importantly, more people learned the correct way to spell and pronounce Hampel. They came back on a number of occasions to teach and to train, and in a temple were bribed to make them both benchers of our inn. I'll leave Joe to tell you more about their international teaching in the discussion which follows, if she would like. He was awarded the prestigious Australia Medal for his advocacy training, and of course Felicity got one too, which she's wearing tonight. His enthusiasm for training never waned. I remember him flying into London on one occasion and coming to our house where he and Felicity were staying with us. The suitcases were barely in the hall before he embarked on an explanation of his new idea, what we now know as Advanced Hampel or Hampel 2, seeking my views and any suggestions that I dared to put forward. His stamina far outshone my own. It is a testament to his love of teaching that he was still an adjunct professor on the Monash University Law Faculty on his death, and was due to teach for them the week after he died. Having lived a life with remarkably good health, age suddenly caught up with him, and on his 91st birthday, the doctors told him that his body was worn out. He accepted his fate without fear or complaint, and died peacefully 4 days later. Well, I'll leave George to have the last word, because he took to poetry towards the very end of his life, and I'm going to ask Master Sarah Clark to read his poem, or one of his poems.
My Life by George Hampel. I love my life, it's the only one I have. I love what I am, I cannot be another. I love where I am, it's my home. I love people, and I never feel alone. Luck has been my friend. I've helped it and it helped me, in hard times and in good, along my long journey. I love the world in all its complexity, and much of it I've seen. The meaning of life for me is life itself, where long time I have been. And when it's time to go, I will remember what a joy it's been to live my life so happily and then to be no more.
That's it. Alistair, Warsaw.
Warsaw in 2019, it was June, and it was a very special trip for both George and Felicity, because as George said on the video, it was essentially the second trip back that he had made. And the organisers at the Advocacy Academy in Warsaw looked after us all, but in particular George and Felicity very well. We had, to re-echo your point about his love of food, Felicity, do you remember we went to Strefa restaurant on the Saturday night? Sadly, a restaurant in Warsaw that is now closed, but George insisted on having, I think, at least 6 courses over the course of the meal. And my abiding memory of George from that night was he had obviously taught with me during the day. And I thought, seeing as I was sitting next to him, I might as well ask the master, if he had any tips for me as an advocacy trainer. And I asked him, and he put his hand on my shoulder and said, Alistair, do you know you're a good advocacy trainer? But watching you today with the lawyers, I think you need to smile more. And I remember listening to this at the restaurant. I didn't mention it to anyone. And I got back to the hotel that night, and we were teaching the next day. And I was doing my first review. And if, Anthony, you're the student lawyer, I would announce the headline. And just after every part of the review, I would just go to the student, and I got to the end of it, and we broke for coffee, and George came up to me at coffee and said, Alistair, I think you need to smile less.
Joe, would you like to say something about overseas training, wherever you've gone, or are you out for a fag at the moment? No, there she is. Right at the back there.
Like Anthony, I first heard about the Hampel method when the Inn sent me off as a guinea pig to the Michael Hill course. Like Anthony, I came away thinking, I don't know who this bloke Hampel is, but clearly he's a sadist, because it is so difficult to understand how to operate this method. And then I went off as a prosecutor to the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague. And working there was a young Australian girl called Magda Karagiannakis. And I was discussing holding an advocacy training course. By then I had decided there was something to be said for the Hampel method. And Magda said, well, I'm sure that the Hampels would be delighted to come and help. And I said, are you sure? I mean, he's a High Court judge or a Supreme Court judge and whatever. And she said, no, I'm sure they will. Anyhow, so she put me in touch with George and Felicity. And we went, as Anthony pointed out, to train not at ICTY, but at the Rwanda Tribunal in Arusha, in Tanzania. And the one thing it was absolutely clear was that nobody there had ever had any kind of advocacy training at all. And for the odd few Americans, there was strong resistance to, I can see Felicity nodding, you remember that, to some of the training. But in the end, it became not only a successful training course, but one that was repeated. And I think the legacy that George and indeed Felicity have left is in a way a tribute to them, because international training, which a number of people from this inn and other inns have undertaken in The Hague, has adopted the Hampel method rather than the American method of training, the NETA method. There now is, as I say, it's a real tribute to George, a organization in The Hague called ILAT, the International, God, I forgot what it stands for, Legal and Advocacy Training, the International Institute of Legal and Advocacy Training. On its website, it specifically says, we train using the Hampel method. And that has proved to be enormously successful. So generations of international lawyers will be learning from George.
Thank you. Felicity, would you like to mention just how many countries you've been to? Here comes the mic.
United States, New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, UK, Poland,
Holland,
well, ICTY and ICTR, and victim advocacy training for the ICC, Scotland.
Yeah, that counts.
Well, I did say England, not UK.
Yeah, I know you did, yes.
Well, England and Scotland. South Africa. I think that might be all. Have I?
Well, it's enough, isn't it? It's Mauritius?
Don't think George and I went to Mauritius, but certainly the AI has been doing a bit more recently, including in Papua New Guinea, and some other Pacific nations.
Yeah.
And I think Vanuatu and, Mauritius.
Yeah.
Bangladesh.
Yeah, because, I mean, George handed over to another of our benchers, Anne Ainsley Wallace, didn't he, for the AAI, and sort of carried on the light from there. Thank you. Does anybody else want to add anything, or do we want to go and have a drink? Yes, there's somebody here. Oh, yes. Not just somebody.
Tracy. I think it's important to remember that George developed the method. He didn't just stay with the Hampel method. He developed it into Hampel 2, which is so important for the new practitioners. We have a different way of developing with new practitioners who have learnt the original method and have come later on. And it's much more interesting to discuss their advocacy. It's not in the same way a tramline that the original method is. And I think the inn was absolutely important in, with George, developing that Hampel 2 method, which we use now and which our experts use, which is so important to the development of the new practitioners and developed practitioners.
Thank you. Anybody else? Then with Master Treasurer's leave, we'll go next door for a drink. Thank you.